The Tamar Yonah Show.
Courage.
Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go.
Audacity.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
History. Miracle. Israel. History.
Broadcasting from Bethel, just north of Jerusalem, D.C. Jerusalem, David's capital. King David's capital. And now, Tamar Yonah.
What you are about to hear is going to be a 2-hour special. We're going to be talking about what an EMP or an electric magnetic pulse bomb could do if detonated over your skies. Right now, there's all the talk about the tension between the Middle East, the United States, Israel. Who will strike first? And will Iran get nuclear weapons? If so, will they try to strike Israel or the big Satan, the USA? Some think that an EMP attack would be benign. It would only take out electricity and devices run by computer or any other machines that are electrical. We're going to find out in this interview exactly what would be affected, what would be destroyed, and most importantly, how you would survive and what may happen to 90% of the population. I'm warning you that this interview will be scary, but I think it will be an in-depth interview to get you fairly familiar with what would happen if you were attacked with an electromagnetic pulse bomb. Joining us now, I have Dr. William Forstchen. He is a history professor specializing in military history and has written over 40 books. He's been on Fox News and several radio shows around the USA, most concentrating on his book called 1 Second After, a novel about what could happen if an EMP bomb was detonated over the United States. Dr. Forstchen says about his book 1 Second After that it wasn't just writing a book to write a book, but he says, quote, I believe the threat of America being hit by an EMP weapon is the single greatest danger to the survival of America. You can find out more about his book and EMP attacks on his website called 1secondafter.com. Shalom, Dr. William Forstchen.
Shalom, and it's a pleasure to be with you this evening.
Well, thank you very much as well. We're all eager to find out exactly what these weapons of mass destruction can actually do if, God forbid, it should fall on any of the countries that we're in, from all of our listeners around the world who are listening to this show. And I'm on your website now, which is called www.onesecondafter.com, and I'm on the part of what is an EMP. And I tell you, it's a long read, but it's a frightening read, and it keeps you glued to your page. So I would like to go over exactly what an EMP is, and that maybe briefly because it's probably going to be very scientific and we might lose a lot of our listeners, but afterwards talk about, how it can affect us, because that's something that everybody's interested in.
EMP, shorthand for electromagnetic pulse. Whenever a nuclear weapon, it doesn't have to be one of the big bombs from the Cold War, it can be a fission-type bomb, exactly like the type that Iran is striving to build right now. When detonated above the Earth's atmosphere, approximately 300 kilometers or up, the gamma ray burst that comes off the bomb in that first millionth of a second of detonation, as the gamma rays hit the upper atmosphere, sets up an electrostatic discharge. Imagine a pebble being tossed off a cliff, rolling downhill, starting an avalanche. what a fire creates is a massive electrostatic discharge that when it strikes the Earth's surface can have an intensity up to 1,000 volts per square meter. That then feeds in through the power grid of the target area and then shorts out and shuts down the entire power infrastructure across an area perhaps of tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of square miles. In 1 second, you are offline, you are shut down, your command and control systems are gone, transportation and everything. It's as if you've been thrown backwards 1,000 years.
And this is from one bomb.
This can be produced from simply one bomb. Thus, here, and I must emphasize as we talk today, I am speaking as an American citizen. I don't represent my government or the military or anything else. I wrote the book as an American citizen concerned about particularly the fate of my country and of Israel, because we are both highly vulnerable to this type of attack. An opponent does not need the massive arsenal that we saw back in the Cold War of hundreds or even thousands. 1, 3, 5 fission bombs could destroy a nation.
So if Iran, now we've read before that Iran has very good relations with Nicaragua, that they've even established some bases there that they could possibly, God forbid, launch missiles from Nicaragua, which is much closer to the USA than Iran is, and use that as their base to launch bombs, God forbid, like these. So with 1 to 5 bombs, you're saying that the whole United States could be taken out?
Yes, and let's look at a scenario. For years, Iran has been doing some practice launches off of cargo container ships out in the Caspian Sea, sending a rocket straight up, goes up about 400 kilometers, comes straight back down. They declare that the launch is a failure. It's not a failure if you're going for an EMP. The scenario that's been talked about on the floor of Congress here in the United States, and actually in the special congressional hearings regarding EMP threat, is a rogue state or an enemy state simply getting a cargo container ship into the Gulf of Mexico, launch from there, upgraded Scud-type missile, or some of the missiles that Iran are currently has in its stockpile, arc it up over the United States, detonate, and you've taken out the power grid. Once you've taken out the power grid, well, for example, as you and I are talking, where is your water supply coming from? As you and I talk this evening, you take a break, you go get a cup of water. Where did that water come from?
Are you asking me, or is this just
like
a
I'm
lead-in?
asking you right now. Well, if you're sipping on some water other than bottled water, where did it come from today?
I can probably only trace it back, 1 or 2 steps, and that would be, since I live on a settlement outside of Jerusalem, about 10 kilometers away, we have a very large water tank that stores our water for the whole community. From there, it would probably, I'm assuming it comes from either Mikorot, which is the Israel water supply, or it would come from a well. I don't know where the original water comes from.
You just said, though, where my concern is. Okay. Your water supply comes from a well, which is electrically powered. Once that electricity is turned off, say goodbye to your water supply forever. Mm-hmm. So what happens within a day or two? You're out of water. Next thing is your food transportation system. Where do you get your food 3 to 5 days down the road? Medical supplies, etc. An EMP doesn't kill directly. It kills indirectly. The congressional study of 2004 estimated that upwards of 90% of all Americans would be dead a year after a major EMP strike.
Wait. I want you to repeat that. You're saying that 12 months after an EMP should, God forbid, be detonated over the United States, that up to 90% of the American population would be dead?
Yes. Consider every major city in America. Where does their water supply come from? Imagine if you have a $1 million penthouse on the 45th floor facing Central Park. How do you live there? It's like being a cliff dweller again. Where does your food come from? What happens to social control, breakdown? What happens to prisons? How do we move medical supplies? How do we make new medications? And When I first started working on this book, a major point for me was nursing homes and hospitals. My father was spending the last months of his life at a nursing home. How do they sustain? They can't. People will die. People will die in America by the tens of millions.
Okay, and you're saying this because after an EMP would be detonated, it would basically fry out the computer boards inside of our cars, computers, airplanes, communication systems, et cetera, et cetera?
Not just that. It's the generating systems. Take a drive across the countryside in Israel, the United States. How far do you go before you pass underneath a high transmission line? I was at a conference several years ago where there was discussion of our high energy transmission systems, and we were watching videos of them being overloaded to the extent of what would happen in an EMP. They literally exploded off the towers and melted. You would have to rewire your entire country, and even then, you'd have to get the parts for your generators to get back online.
What about
Electricity's
wires?
gone.
What about electricity wires that are buried underneath the ground?
Some people say, well, gee, this does sound science fiction, and I bet a couple of your listeners might be thinking, is this gentleman wearing a tinfoil hat tonight? I urge folks, when the program is over, go on the computer and look up the following. Starfish Prime. Starfish Prime. That was an American test of an EMP in 1962. The weapon was detonated over the Central Pacific, 500 miles away in Oahu. The electrical grid pretty well was blown offline. The Soviets did a test called Soviet Test 184 over Kazakhstan at about the same time. A power station 500 miles away blew out and caught on fire because of the overload that was transmitted underground through electrical cables. Because the electrical force from an EMP doesn't stop at the ground. It's moving. Remember, the Earth is like a giant magnet. It is trying to move towards the magnetic core of the Earth. So whether your power cables are buried or above ground, they're going to fry off.
All right. So is there a way that, let's say Israel, there was an article on IsraelNationalNews.com, actually it was an op-ed piece, of someone saying that perhaps one of the best ways to nullify the nuclear threat from Iran would be to detonate an EMP over Iran. Is there a way to be able to detonate a small bomb where it would only hit over a small area? Or is this something that once you release it, it just goes out of control?
I have to emphasize before answering that question, I'm speaking as a private citizen, as an American who has a profound love and respect and support for the state of Israel and believes that Israel is the best ally we have in the world just about. And yes, an EMP strike against Iran could take their system down. An EMP event is defined by what's called line to horizon. You know how when you go on a plane, the further up you fly, the further out you can see. 250 miles up, you could sweep out across the entire continental United States. At a lower altitude, if Israel should decide to make such a move, it could be contained fairly well inside the state of Iran and would be highly effective.
Mm-hmm. So if Iran were to use it against Israel, then, and we're a very small country, smaller than the state of New Jersey, so would they be taking out at the same time Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or they could also detonate something smaller, closer to the surface of the earth and just take out Israel?
I find it interesting you compare the size of the state of Israel to the state of New Jersey, where I'm originally from, because when I talk about the situation that Israel is in, I do point out, imagine you live in a state the size of New Jersey, and your neighbors in New York and Pennsylvania have heaved something like 8,000 missiles into your territory in the previous wave of attacks, and continue to do so almost on a daily basis. A detonation against Israel would have to be lower altitude if Iran truly had deep concern for how they might impact the situation in Jordan, Syria, or Egypt. There would be some overlap into those countries. I wonder, though, how concerned Iran would be about that, given statements they make about their intentions regarding Israel.
Right. And as they say themselves, that a nuclear war, a worldwide war, would be a great idea in order to bring their Mahdi, their Messiah from Islam. So very interesting. All right, so let's go back to your website again. We're looking at 1secondafter.com if people want to follow with us. And you start out by talking about what would happen if an EMP were to be detonated and you were in an airplane. So why don't we go from there?
Almost everybody in the world remembers the incredible pilot, Captain, quote unquote, Sully, who several years ago over New York City, there was the bird strike, ran into a flock of geese, which were pulled into both engines of his plane, and recall the incredible piloting job he did of ditching that plane in the Hudson River. He could do so because he still had electrical power and hydraulic power to the control surfaces, the ailerons that turn your wings, the rudder, and the elevator. So he could still fly the plane. An EMP of significant magnitude, well, let's just say every time I get on a commercial flight to go overseas and I peek into the cockpit and I see what pilots call a glass cockpit, meaning it's just all computers, I do sweat a little bit because blow out the computer systems on an airplane. Even with a Captain Sully in the cockpit, the joystick doesn't connect in the way we used to think with wires and everything else, such as in the antique airplane I fly. It's hooked to a computer, which feeds to another computer in the tail, which activates the controls. In other words, it's a falling brick. At any given moment, there's well over 2,000 commercial flights crisscrossing the United States. Most of them would fall like rocks in the first minute.
You, if you are in an airplane, are going to crash.
You'll have enough time to pray on the way down.
You're optimistic. All right.
That's why.
All right, let's say you're in your car. What happens?
There's a lot of debate about the issue of the impact on automobiles. I would refer people to a YouTube site. Just simply type in Ford Taurus EMP, and you can see a test that's run as to how much of an EMP overload would take out a modern car. If there have been serious tests, it's classified information. And another thing I have to emphasize here, I only work on unclassified, declassified information. I have no access. There's times I've been at conferences, I've asked questions, and everybody else in the room just fell silent and stared at me and said, we're not going to talk about that. Regarding autos, I've heard figures from as low as 5% up to 98% of all cars made after about 1985 are going to cook off. I definitely would not want to be in a Prius or a Volt if this happened. But think of your daily traffic jams around Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, New York City. What happens if even only 5% of the cars on the road suddenly stalled?
So
you're gridlocked.
Right, you're gridlocked, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, and so you're in your car, and all of a sudden everything just stops. I imagine that some people will lose control, and there'll be crashes as well.
Yes.
All right, and ambulances can't get you because their ambulances are not going to work. Phones are going to go out.
Right.
Cell phones also.
A funny quick story. And we have to put some humor in here occasionally, otherwise your audience might get so completely depressed they'll turn off. But it was about a year ago, a thunderstorm was rolling across the mountains where I live, and suddenly the entire valley went dark. About a minute later, my cell phone rang, and it was an employee of the college I work at, rather in a panic, shouting, "Don't tell me this is it." To which my response was, "Is your cell phone working?" I was like, well, yeah, we're cool. The cell phone still works. It's just an electrical storm. Cell phones are gone.
All right.
That The thing that we can't live without now would be gone.
Okay. Does that have an effect on the satellites up in the air, on EMP?
Satellites, that's a complex issue. Realize, satellites are built to withstand very high levels of exposure to radiation because they are well above the Earth's atmosphere. It's generally believed the vast majority of satellites will continue to function, but satellites are up there to communicate back down to stations on Earth. If the station on Earth has been taken offline, what good is the satellite?
All right, and so your cell phone wouldn't work because why? Because the cell phone itself has computer board inside, or what?
Well, there is a certain dependency here on line of sight from the point of detonation of the weapon, how far away you are you standing directly underneath it when it goes? You're going to get a pretty high electrical overload that most likely would blow out a cell phone that was out in the open. But it's the complex infrastructure that handles cell phones. The towers, the computers that route the calls, transfer you automatically from one tower to another, they're all gone. Therefore, how's your cell phone going to connect into another one, even if the cell phone is still functional?
So we're going to have to go back to smoke signals.
Yeah, those of us who are left.
All right. Is there any way that we can prevent our machinery from being fried? Is it that it's only if it's plugged into the wall? If your car is not on, will your car also suffer this? I mean, is there any way we can save our things?
There are debates on that as well between classified, unclassified information. But even if, for example, we're having a thunderstorm here right now, the television is turned off, but it's still plugged in. Lightning strike, I can most likely say goodbye to the television. So even if it's turned off, it could still most likely be damaged. Turned on with a full power load going through, the overspike will be even more dangerous. But there are ways of protecting the system, which perhaps we could talk about in the second segment, because it gets a little bit complex, some of it.
Okay. All right, so we're going to take a break now. Again, we're speaking with Dr. William Forstchen, and we are talking about the effects of an EMP, electric magnetic pulse bomb, whether it should be used, God forbid, against the USA, Israel, if it's against any country in the world, and again, if there's a possibility perhaps Israel could use something like this. We want to find out the effects of this, and we're going to be exploring this in detail in the show. We're going to be right back.
You're listening to
Israel National Radio.
You're listening to Israel
National Radio.
You are listening to
National
Israel National Radio.
Hello? Yeah, I wanted to know, do you deliver falafels to the top of Mount Zion? Great! I'd like a large falafel with pepperoni, sausage, and extra cheese. Yes, I know what a falafel is.
You're listening to IsraelNationalRadio.com.
You people are so pushy.
What, Israeli people are pushy? You, stay there, surrounded by your great enemy Canada. Try Syria for 2 months, then we'll see who's pushy.
Connect to Israel through Israel National Radio.
The Tamar Yonah Show.
Courage.
Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go.
Audacity.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
History. Miracle. Hope.
No more bloodshed. Shalom. Salam forever.
Israel.
Broadcasting from Bethel, just north of Jerusalem, D.C. That's right, Jerusalem, David's capital. King David's capital. King David's capital. And now, Tamar Yonah.
I want you to take a listen to this very short video clip entitled EMP, A Terrorist's Dream. The film directs you to www.warfooting.com.
Oh, my God. Mr. President, we have a national emergency.
A nuclear weapon atop a ballistic missile has been launched from a freighter off the coast of the United States. The weapon is not designed to kill Americans, at least not directly and right away. Instead, it is meant to unleash EMP, an electromagnetic pulse that destroys electronic devices and power grids. As it detonates 300 miles above the United States, the single explosion unleashes electronic waves 1 million times more powerful than any radio signal on Earth. In the United States, nearly all computers fail. Telecommunications end. Transportation comes to a halt. The stock market's crippled. Bank accounts disappear. Federal officials warn EMP could paralyze America, instantly returning our country to a pre-industrial age.
Again, that's on YouTube if you want to see the entire video. We are back with Dr. William Forstchen. He is the author of the book 1 Second After, and he is an expert on the effects of an EMP bomb if it were to, God forbid, take place anywhere in the world. And he's here talking about the how we can perhaps safeguard our machinery at home in order to have possibly something working if, God forbid, an EMP should be detonated over our area. So you were talking in the last segment, Dr. Forstchen, about how we can safeguard things. Can you go into a little bit more detail?
Yes. It's called hardening. Our military, American military, your defense force, et cetera, they're all familiar with it. And it is simply overbuilding and hardening particular systems to be resistant to EMP. It's an expensive process. For example, military aircraft are quite heavily hardened against this type of disturbance. Our civilian infrastructures, though, are rather wide open. There are things that can be done at minimal cost, which is installing a different type of circuit breaker that is able to quickly detect the overload and shut down segments of our power system. The analogy I give is, think of those beautiful spring mornings when you'd step outside and you would see the little spider webs on the lawn and they're covered in dew. You always have some little boy who goes up with a match and wants to just burn the whole thing out. But imagine if some of those threads were fireproof. How much easier would the spider's job be in rebuilding the entire web? So I've been urging, and friends of mine in Congress have been urging for years, to at least harden parts of our infrastructure in the United States. And I pray that such is being done in Israel, that it makes recovery a lot quicker. Secondly, the stockpiling securely of key replacement components for generation, transmission. The problem is we don't. We should. Third, there's something called Faraday cages. F-A-R-A-D-A-Y. Anyone listening can pull it up on the internet, and for a few dollars, you can build a Faraday cage to put electronic components into. I know people who have backup parts for their autos that they just simply put inside Faraday cages. So there are ways of beefing up the structure to prevent an EMP. But I think there's also one more component, and that must be a very robust foreign policy that conveys to a potential opponent, if you're even thinking of this or we suspect it, we will act. That is why I have such admiration for your leader and the way he stood up at the UN this week. We must prevent nations like Iran from gaining the capability, because I see an Iranian weapon as having only one real significant use, and that is to use it as an EMP.
To use as an EMP. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right, and we all know that's right, and we all know that Israel is the little Satan, but America is the big Satan, and we're just the canary in the coal mine. After they would, God forbid, attack Israel, there wouldn't be peace in the world. It wouldn't be like, okay, now the problem is over, and we can all sit on the beach in a circle on the sand around a campfire and sing Kumbaya.
I was going to say sing Kumbaya, yes. Yeah.
So, America would be next, God forbid, or the West. We can.
I think it would be both simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the way to do it. Yeah, if they are. All right. So you've talked about this Faraday cage, and you would put your equipment in there that in case, God forbid, an EMP was detonated, your items that you put in there would be safe.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. All right. So what about older cars that don't run on computer chips, cars that are like 30 years old?
Oh. Do you know how many people will scramble for a 1962 Volkswagen?
Well, that's what I'm wondering. Will those work?
Pre cars from the days of carburetors, pre-electronic ignition, no computer parts whatsoever. They'll just keep humming along. The vulnerability in today's automobiles are all the computerized systems that now run them. Mm-hmm. There's your weak point. Mm-hmm. I do know some folks, and you can also find sites on the internet where you can retrofit your auto that you have a backup in case the electronic systems suddenly all cook off. So if you could stash a 1962 Volkswagen somewhere in your garage, you're in good shape.
Mm-hmm. But then wouldn't the roads be littered with cars that are just, so you really wouldn't be able to get too far with the car. Maybe it's better to take a retro motorcycle or something.
That's actually the best thinking of all, because you're right. It's even those cars that might still be functional, gridlocked. Do you recall the power failure in India this summer that a fair part of their infrastructure went down for 2 or 3 days? And there was a video of one of their interstate highway systems, 10 lanes, gridlocked to the horizon. Not because the cars had failed, but because the signal lights had failed. And then they started to have accidents. People were stalled for hours, ran out of gas, and had to abandon their cars. So even if we had, say, half our cars were still functional post-EMP, how do you move them? Mm-hmm. And then in your situation in Israel, the need to rapidly clear roads because of defense issues and the potential of invasion. So I think a smarter move would be to have a bicycle or a good old-fashioned motorcycle that still runs on a carburetor.
Or maybe even a tractor. So you could just like mow all these cars away as you're going down the streets, just like move them around out of the way. All right. So we are now in a situation, let's just pretend, as on your website you give scenarios, 12 hours after attack. Well, let's go for the first moment. If you're sitting at your kitchen table, I remember reading, you said all of a sudden the lights go out, the radio goes off that you were listening to, and you say, whoa, it must be an electricity outage. And how do you know the difference between an electricity outage and that an EMP was actually detonated?
The giveaways, and believe me, I have friends who say every time the electricity flutters now, they go, oh no, and then they call me up. It's a full shutdown of your electrical support systems. Your radio that's plugged in doesn't work. Your iPad, iPhone are suddenly offline. The television is offline. You might see the horrifying sight of a jet going down, and just some total silence. All of the background noise of a modern electronic world has ceased. On 9/11, now I live in a semi-rural area in western North Carolina, but I can remember coming home, waiting for my daughter to come home from school, and then sitting outside and just how quiet it was. There were no planes overhead. There was no traffic on the interstate because everybody had gone home. And that is the giveaway that something major has happened, the silence. But let me add one other thing, that on 9/11, within a matter of an hour, we had a leader like Rudy Giuliani speaking to America from ground zero saying, we're going to pull together as Americans and we're going to see our way through this. And every great tragedy across the last 50, 75 years, our leadership has been able to reach us via radio and television, tell us what's going on, and tell us to pull through, and we're going to work together. Imagine a world with total silence. Well, you don't know what's going on. You told me you're about 10 kilometers outside of Jerusalem. Imagine you're in total silence and you don't know what's going on up at the Golan Heights or down in the Sinai at that moment. All you know is there's silence where you are.
All right, that is a very scary scenario. So let's say that you are in your car when this happens, and all of a sudden your car just dies. And let's say that you're one of the lucky ones that you were able to come to a stop without crashing into a car. But let's say you're 30 miles from home, or 60 miles from home, or even 10 miles from. Well, let's a little bit further, like 30 miles from home. Something that's going to be very, very difficult for you to walk. What is the best thing to do?
Well, we have an acronym for that, GOD, G-O-D, get out of Dodge. Everybody should have a GOD kit in their vehicle, a get out of Dodge, meaning an emergency supply kit. And particularly Israel, which is on the front line and in places is barely 30 kilometers across. I pray that every citizen there has an emergency pack in their car, water, food, if they need medication, but have already pre-discussed with their families, okay, if something goes down, here's where we all meet. I might not be able to reach you by telephone when this happens. We might not know what's going on, but we're going to meet at this house, or we're going to meet at our grandparents' house, or whatever. But everybody should have a backup pack like that with them at all times.
Very, very good suggestion, because I've heard of firemen saying just in saving people from fires how one family was screaming, my daughter, she's still in the house, she's not here. And he ran back into this house where it was just about to fall down upon him, and he couldn't find her. He came out, and they found out that the daughter was waiting across the street someplace where they didn't see her. And because they didn't have a meeting place, he almost lost his life, and he was furious. He was furious about that. He said, you've got to have a meeting place so everyone knows that you can make your count and you know everybody's there.
My daughter goes to university about 15 miles from home, and she knows that if the bad stuff goes down, whichever way possible, and no matter what professors at her college might say different, oh, let's all sit here and sing Kumbaya, no, she heads for home immediately, because that's the rendezvous point.
All right, so let's go now. It's 12 hours afterwards. You're without electricity. You can't make phone calls. Your cell phone doesn't work. That's another sign you know it's not just an electricity outage, because your cell phone should work in an electricity outage. And it's 12 hours now. And what's going to happen? What's going to start to happen in the world?
Wherever we are, you're going to start seeing a breakdown of social order, because in that total vacuum of information, the bad guys, as we can call them, those who would just love to go on a criminal spree, or in a situation such as in Israel, go on an attack spree, things are going to start to socially unravel rather quickly, because there's no command and control. How do police forces, how do military communicate, get to the points of danger? I mean, if something happened at my house at this very moment, I would toss our iPad aside, pull out the cell phone, and call my local police. They'd be here in 3 or 4 minutes. Now I'd be totally isolated. 12 hours into the event is when the real waking up starts. Something bad's happened. We better everybody's going to start to think the same thing. We better get food. We better get water. And that's when a panic can set in, unless people are trained beforehand and our first responders and those on the front line know what to do. And also citizens are prepared. I mentioned the God pack that you should have in your vehicle. Every home should have, no matter where they are, whether you're in Tel Aviv, Miami, or Denver, you should have a week or two worth of supplies on hand. Drinking water, food, some source of power, lighting. It doesn't cost all that much to do so.
You talk about on your website that the food in your freezer is going to start to thaw. Let's just take this a bit further. So you're starting to have a very bad smell coming out of your refrigerator. In
Yes.
your bathrooms, you can't flush your toilet. There's going to be very, very bad smells and diseases building up in your toilet. It's going to be perhaps even unlivable in your house with the stench. So continue from there.
Wow, you're taking us through the nightmare. And part of this is dependent upon the time of year. Let's say it's the middle of the summer, and what are temperatures in Jerusalem in July, for example?
Oh, there could be 30, 33 degrees Celsius.
So that's pushing up, I'm doing my math quick, high 80s, 90s Fahrenheit for those here in the States. Yeah, your food supply in your fridge is going to become questionable in 24 hours, and in 48 hours, you will get very sick. One of the things that will start to hit within several days is the beginnings of major outbreaks of gastrointestinal illnesses because people are drinking unsafe water or consuming food of questionable quality. We live in a very sanitized society today, thank God, where our government oversees food production and safety standards and such. If we even have a 1-hour power outage here in the States, most restaurants are required to throw everything out because the food supply becomes questionable. So yet again, those families who are prepared beforehand that can hunker down and say, okay, kids, we got food, we got a propane stove, we got freeze-dried food here and canned food. We'll eat what we can out of the fridge for the first day, throw the rest out, and then we'll get through this. Those are the ones who have a distinct advantage. But 12 hours in, I would say on the streets, it's going to start getting somewhat dangerous within 3 to 5 days, potentially out of control. Again, unless you have a population that is well-trained in how to handle this type of situation.
I hear your parrot in the background.
Parrot gets very upset when I start talking about this, so I'm going to move away from him.
That's right, because the parrot's going to go also.
I don't want to hear this again.
Right. He could, I could probably interview him. He memorized your whole speech every time you're on the radio about this. Okay. All right. So let's go back for a moment to law enforcement. So you write here that law enforcement will be powerless because A, their cars probably will not work. Their telephone system's not going to work. You're not going to be able to reach them. They may be wanting to run back to their own families as well, not leaving their wives and children alone, knowing very well how, the crime can go up in a time like this. Hospitals have generators, but what would happen there?
Oh, I'm glad you led us into that. Katrina. I was just talking with a surgeon at my local hospital only about a month ago about Katrina. And in fact, I'm meeting with a hospital group next week to talk about preparedness for this. Katrina, as we know, was a nightmare. Hospitals. Now we have to shift to a very grim subject. They're not prepared at all. And New Orleans, it's something we in America don't like to talk about, but there's been some fairly clear statements that some of the staff practice euthanasia, that they overdose some of their patients. In order to get a patient out of that hospital, they had to haul them up 6-7 flights of stairs, get them up on the roof, and wait for a helicopter at 100-degree heat. There was a nursing home where they found over 40 dead floating against the ceiling.
Oh, my.
Oh, my God, yes. Our hospitals are woefully unprepared to handle this type of disaster because when you walk into any hospital, go 100 feet in. Are there any windows? Everything's dependent upon the fluorescent lighting overhead. The conversation with that surgeon was triggered because my daughter was having surgery, and he had read my book. We talked about it later, and he talked about a power flux that hospital had about a year ago. He said for a very tense 2 minutes, the entire operating room was blacked out because the emergency generator didn't kick in. So people will instinctively start to head towards hospitals, particularly those with medical conditions, thinking they're going to be able to get help there. Instead, it will turn into an even worse disaster area because they don't have the supplies, they don't have the electrical power, they're so highly dependent upon computers that it will become a nightmare. It will look like something out of the Middle Ages.
I'm afraid there would be crime there as well. I mean, people need medicines to live. There could be violence, and the hospitals aren't going to give anything out just because you say that you're a diabetic and you need insulin, or you say that you're a heart patient and you need these pills. There could be a lot of violence there.
In my novel, 1 Second After, to convey that point, one of the characters, his daughter is a diabetic, a type 1. And part of the plot is, how far is he willing to go? What is he willing to do to get the insulin needed to keep his daughter going until a resupply starts again? But then again, the factories that make insulin are offline. So you see we have a cascading series of events. Again, it's the pebble rolling downhill, triggering an avalanche, which explains, going back to that shocking number at the start, the projections that upwards of 90% of all citizens in America would be dead a year after a major EMP strike.
This is all very scary, what you're telling us, and I want to go more into it. We're coming again to a break. Again, we're speaking with Dr. William Forstchen. He's the author of the book 1 Second After, which describes what could happen after the United States would be hit with an EMP detonation above the atmosphere, how to best prepare and what to expect. So stay with us. This is a 2-hour special that we're doing. We have another hour coming up where we're going to be intensely taking an in-depth look at what's happening during something like this, and we'll be right back after the break.
Arutz Sheva and every single show on Arutz Sheva. You guys are leading. This is what leadership is all about. You are putting the truth out. You are unstoppable, determined, focused, committed to putting the truth out. And I pray that you will be able to wake up as many people in Israel to start listening to you, for the leadership to follow in your footsteps. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to come on your show and be able to express my opinion.
IsraelNationalRadio.com. We're your connection to Israel.
This is a Jewish history moment. In 1976, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine hijacked a commercial airplane from Israel to Entebbe Airport in Uganda, where they separated all the Jewish and Israeli passengers and threatened to kill them if Israel did not give in to their demands. Instead, Israel sent airplanes into the airport under cover of darkness, and the military, which were in the aircraft, shot up the terrorists and freed the prisoners. Out of the 100 or so hostages, only Mrs. Dora Bloch was not rescued because she had been taken to a hospital in Kampala and was subsequently murdered on Idi Amin's orders. The surprise rescue mission was led by Lieutenant Colonel Yoni Netanyahu, the only soldier killed during the mission. The success of the mission, called Operation Thunderbolt, led to books and movies being made of the rescue, and Yoni Netanyahu is being hailed as a hero. This Jewish history moment is brought to you by Israel National Radio.
We love Israel National Radio!
The Tamar Yona Show.
Courage.
Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go.
Audacity.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
History. Miracle. Hope.
No more bloodshed. Shalom. Salam forever.
Israel.
Broadcasting from Bethel, just north of Jerusalem, D.C. That's right, Jerusalem, David's capital. King David's capital. King David's capital. And now, Tamar Yona.
We are back with Dr. William Forstchen, the author of the book 1 second after. We're talking about what would happen in an EMP attack if a bomb like this would detonate over your skies. And Doctor, we were speaking about the hospitals, that if anybody has some type of chronic disease, they could expect that they would be one of the first to die off after an attack because, for instance, I remember reading this on your website, if you are a diabetic, the insulin has to be brought by truck to the pharmacy or wherever you would pick up your insulin. It has to be brought in a refrigerated truck. As we know, after an EMP attack, trucks probably will not be working. Highways will be clogged. There will be no refrigeration, and therefore you would probably only survive as long as your medications would last you. Is that correct?
Yes, and let's elaborate on that slightly, that in this incredible age we all live in, what percentage of us are on medications that vary from, they just make life a little bit better or a little bit more comfortable or the arthritis a little less painful, to you have to faithfully take this pill twice a day or in a week, you're going to be in a very bad situation or dead. Another aspect, approximately 15 to 20% of the population is on some form of medication to deal with anxiety, depression, and other things in our age of anxiety. Heck, listen to this program long enough, and I think people will want to get a prescription for that.
Or a good stiff drink, yes.
Yes. But about 1/2 to 1% of the population are on medications that didn't exist 75 years ago, 50 years ago, and therefore were institutionalized, but now are able to somewhat function in our society. What happens when their medication runs out? Our pharmacies operate on just-in-time delivery. So let's say I went into the pharmacy this afternoon to order medication for a heart condition. They filled a prescription. Well, it punches into a computer. It goes up to their central office. It goes to an automatic refill. A day later, the FedEx truck pulls up, and there's a resupply. Pharmacies don't keep a month to 3 months of meds on hand, particularly those which are controlled substances.
Let me ask you this. You said at the beginning of the show that within a year, 12 months, up to 90% of the population could be dead.
Yes.
What would most of them die from? Would it be dysentery, eating food and drinking water that is tainted, that is not safe? What's going to kill off this 90%?
The breakdown in the United States is going to hit at 3 or 4 key points. First of all, at least 250,000 unfortunate souls that are in the air at the moment an EMP hits. Almost all of them are gone. It would make the event of 9/11 pale in comparison, where we lost 3,000. Imagine 250,000. Now, imagine an enemy. Imagine somebody like the ruler of Iran contemplating, what can I do with one bomb that would really hurt? That would be it. Second casualty rate would kick in within a day or two, and that is people who daily require significant medication. And all of those also in nursing homes. And talking with staff at nursing homes, they say that within a couple of days, maybe upwards of 50% of their patients would die if they didn't have all the various support systems for them. There goes a couple million more. Then we have the onset of gastrointestinal illnesses due to tainted water, tainted food. Then within a span of 30 days, we're starting to face massive starvation as food supplies run out. Do you want me to keep going? This just keeps getting more and more depressing.
Yeah, I do. I want people to understand exactly how this domino effect will take place. So even if you have to scare us, we want to know the truth.
Your average community today has on hand total food supply, meaning what's in the family pantry and kitchen, what's in the local market, what's in the trucks that are backing up to the market. Your average community could perhaps stretch out a food supply for 21 days, maybe 4 weeks. And then it just comes up a total brick wall. The food supply is gone. Now, in some parts of the world where you're living in a food production area, let's say you happen to live near an orchard outside of Jerusalem, and it just so happens to be the time of year where the harvest is coming in. Well, you're going to be okay for a while. But you might also have 10,000 people walking in your direction figuring, gee, there's food in that orchard. I'm going to give me some. See, now you see the problems of how far are people willing to go to get food? In other words, take food from you. And if so, do so violently. And then we also see the breakdown of social order, where criminals or enemies of a country are going to see this as a field day. Your die-off rate then really starts to pick up around 40 to 50 days as the significant effects of starvation start to set in, particularly with young children and the elderly first. Also, those whose 30-day supplies of significant medications have run out and can't be resupplied. Some of the data I drew on when researching the book was looking at what happened in the siege of Leningrad. When rations in Leningrad for what were defined as non-essential civilians was cut to 700 calories a day during the worst of the siege. Some of your listeners, knowing the history of Leningrad, might recall that, in fact, in the bakeries, they started mixing sawdust into the flour to bulk it out. Now, the government had to put guards around the bakeries to prevent people from trying to loot. And they were mixing sawdust into the flour to bulk out the 2 slices of bread each person received to make them think they were getting more, but also the wood pulp expanded in a person's stomach and killed the hunger pangs.
Did it kill the patient as well?
No, it just, well, there was no nutrition from it, so of course they were dying, but at least they weren't feeling quite as hungry as they died. And that, we got to remember, that happened within the lifetime of some of the people listening to this program. And perhaps some of the people listening to this program actually lived through that. So it wasn't all that long ago.
Right. We
saw similar circumstances during World War II in China. Starvation killed millions of people. Isn't it not almost incomprehensible to us to think that such could happen in Israel or America? But it can. So that's sort of your sequence of die-off until that percentage of the population that is able to survive has gotten through a year, has figured out how to create new food supply by planting crops, whatever, and then try and rebuild if they still have a country left.
Okay, so basically the first to go would be if you weren't killed in a plane that went down or crashing your car, but unless you're not killed in the instant that this bomb should go off, the next ones that would be dying would probably be diabetics or have some type of chronic problem. They would run out of medication. People would die from dysentery. They would dehydrate because they couldn't keep anything down in their system. There would be no water, no food, starvation, and old people and babies and children.
Yes.
These are the first ones, the weakest ones to go.
Yes.
That would take out approximately how much of the population right there?
You've wiped out a good 10 to 20% of the population within a matter of a couple of weeks.
Wow. And so, and how would you even bury all of these bodies?
Do we really want to think about that? Because the amount of energy it takes to bury a person, if you don't have backhoes and everything else working, it would become mass graves or mass funeral pyres.
Let me ask you this. You talked very interestingly about if you live in a high-rise. Now, where would be the best place, the safest place to be if, God forbid, you were suffering from an EMP attack? Would it be in a high rise where very few people would want to climb up the 40 flights in order to get to you, and you would only have to go down maybe once a week to try to find supplies? Or would it be to be in the country where a lot of preppers, as they call them today, have, bought property and are planning for just such a scenario? What if you live in the suburbs? Should you stay in your home? Where would you think is the safest place to be?
Really nowhere. Everywhere and nowhere. We take a major urban built-up area, get out. Because, again, of societal breakdown. Sure, you're up 40 stories. You think people might not want to come up the 40 stories to try and loot what you have. When people are getting desperate, they'll come up the 40 stories. But beyond that, where do you have to do that 40-story hike? And think about somebody in their 60s doing a 40-story hike every day or two to try and get water and haul it back up and food. Mm. But if you get out of cities, where do you go? You hit the suburbs. Are people going to be joyfully throwing open their doors and saying, gee, come on in, neighbor, let's sing Kumbaya, I'll share some food with you? You see the problems here, and it's why I keep trying to emphasize Katrina should have taught all Americans, don't wait for the government to come and save you. Start building your infrastructure from the bottom up. Start talking with your neighbors. Coordinate. Okay, and it doesn't have to be an EMP. It could be a major hurricane, earthquake, whatever. But have a plan with your neighbors. All right, if things go bad, how can we pool our resources together? Who goes up to help the widow Jones up the hill who's in an electric wheelchair and we know will be stuck? How do we make sure people we don't want, dangerous type people, perhaps coming to take what we have? From there, build up through your community. I find that when I talk with the mayors of communities, firefighters, policemen, etc., they're eager to want to develop a plan and work together. And then from there, go up to your regional level. Another great system of organizing is through churches and synagogues. How can we, within our community of faith, work together to help each other? Perhaps that might even be the rendezvous place for some people, particularly people who need help. All right, if I go to my synagogue, I know there's a community there that will help me. If I go to my church, there's a community that will help me. And I can also help in turn. Pre-planning for this is everything. Thinking about this, you did that great little story about the little girl and the fireman in the fire. And fireman came within a hair's breadth of dying. It would have only taken 15 seconds beforehand for the parents to say to that daughter, honey, if there's ever a fire, this is where we meet.
So let's go back to the scenario. There's no electricity. And the next day, you say that, of course, since there's no electricity, there's going to be no antennas working, no communications. If you are, let's say, somebody who works at Fox News, you're not going to go to work the next day because there's no television, there's no radio. And if there's no work, then you're not making any money. And now you've got an economy, a nation with very few people going to work, very, very few people going to work. Nobody's making any money now. Banks are closed. Tell us about that.
Yet again, I'm answering that. Let me swing all the way back to early in our conversation. If you were an enemy of Israel or of the United States and you wanted to deliver the most bang for the buck, do you see where it is? Because you're talking about complete economic collapse as well. What percentage of America's money, what percentage of Israel's money is in fact in electronic form, is not a piece of paper, is not a dollar bill. It's electronic. That whole grid goes down. And I can picture people lining up at ATMs an hour after this happens thinking, I better get my money out. Is the ATM even going to act? Or go into the bank. Let's say there's still some employees there. And it's like, hey, I want to pull my account out. It's like, sorry, sir, we don't have access to it. It's all on computer. So your economic system has collapsed in that first second as well. Now, granted, the banks, our economic institutions are constantly doing backups. They're aware of EMP. They store the data, but it's getting the data back out to your local branches. That's where the breakdown happens. So maybe 10 years afterwards, you'll finally get a note in the mail. Hey, interest is accrued on the money you had in the bank the day before it happened, if you're still alive.
All right, and then how do these people? Let's just take this as a, let's just run with this. So let's say that you are a presenter on Fox News. There's no going to work the next day. You're living in New York, and no money, no job. You're living in a high rise. I mean, let's say that you did put away enough food and water for a couple of weeks, as you're saying. What then? What after those 2 weeks?
You just asked me the toughest question. I would just pray for your sake, for everyone's sake, that they have a long-term plan. That even beyond 2 weeks' food, they have additional supplies. Therefore, do we not see yet again that the best defense against EMP is to make sure it never happens in the first place, because this is a war-winning move in the first second. This is a knockout blow. 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, they destroyed our Pacific Fleet. They didn't destroy the entire United States. 44 months later, we had 1,000 ships anchored in Tokyo Bay as payback. On the day Israel was hit on the Yom Kippur War, it was a hellish first week. You were fighting for survival, but you had enough reserve and capability to finally come back. And though costly, you saved your country, you preserved your freedom. Coming back from an EMP is an entirely different scenario. And a lot of people trying to do an analysis of this, it's like, can we ever come back after we've been hit? Therefore, we had to make sure it never happens to start with. Mm-hmm. And I'll emphasize yet again, as a private citizen, that is why I applaud your leader who is saying there has to be a red line that if you even start to approach this, we cannot tolerate it. I just wish that in the public dialogue there was more discussion as to what could be done fatally, even to the United States, with only a few warheads.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying the first person who launches an EMP attack is most likely going to be the winner, and the country that receives it is going to be the loser.
Well, okay, I'll go to the novel that I wrote 1 second after, where towards the end of the book, the survivors within the particular community, my book covers just what happens across 1 year, in which a discussion comes up that, yeah, this came from these two particular countries, we think. In fact, there's even that scenario where you might not be able to immediately trace where the EMP came from. If it comes from a cargo ship, which then blows up. And so there's discussion. Oh yeah, we gave them payback. Yeah, they're a glass factory now. That's all we took them out completely. And then my main character says, so does that bring back what we were? Does that give us back what we were the day before it happened? Even if we win, we've lost. That's why we have to make sure. Israel and America has to make sure an EMP is never used. Because even, let's say, in the old-fashioned sense, a week or two later, the dust settles and we say, yeah, we won. We really gave them payback. Is that victory? And I even had to present a moral question. For example, let's say it was North Korea. We'll move it out of the Middle East. Let's say it was North Korea. Who in North Korea do we fight back against? The 90% of the population that lives on the surface and are a little better than slaves? They had nothing to do with this. Striking them, is that the moral answer back? While the leadership that does it survives in bunkers thousands of feet deep? There's a lot of moral paradoxes, moral problems in this. This would be unlike any other war in history.
Mm-hmm. Could an EMP, I mean, are these leaders safe in these underground bunkers from the effects of an EMP?
Oh, of course. Has that not always been true through most of history? That the ones who create the nightmare, they make sure their bunker is well secured.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the demon of the 20th century in Berlin. His bunker was there right until the Russians were just about knocking on the door. He was surviving quite comfortably, while millions of his people died on the surface. So it's fair to assume the leadership in the two states in particular I'm concerned about, Iran and North Korea, they're well supplied.
So how far would this bomb be able to penetrate underground? And how deep do you have to be underground in order to protect yourself?
You can almost be on the surface and actually realize that when an EMP is detonated, it's detonated very high up in the atmosphere. So, again, we have to erase that thinking of all the films we see with the shock wave and buildings bursting into flames, et cetera, et cetera. The only thing you'll notice is suddenly the power goes off, unless you are looking straight at the point of detonation, where you would see a flash of light about as bright as the sun. So it's the electrical overload. Now, if your building on the surface is well-proofed, essentially Faraday caged, whatever is in it will survive. Mm-hmm. I know somebody who's manufacturing command and control centers that are simply trailers that you have behind a building. It would survive. The deep bunkers would survive. That would involve using conventional weapons to try and dig them out. But any facility, home, system that is not protected against an EMP will then essentially becomes uninhabitable and useless.
All right, we're going to stop here. We have to take a break again. We're going to be back for our last segment with Dr. William Forstchen, and we're going to talk about in the next segment what would happen afterwards with your municipalities, the White House. What would be the next step if an enemy wanted to take over your country, and how would our leaders react? We'll be right back.
This is Rabbi Mordechai Smolarczyk from Boca Raton, Florida, and I love Israel National Radio. I listen to it every day on my iPhone and my iPad. You can too. Israel National Radio is awesome.
Hi, my name is Zahara. I'm from Los Angeles, and I'm spending 3 years in Israel at a high school program in Hod HaSharon. I love listening to Arutz Sheva, IsraelNationalRadio.com.
Hi, I'm Bill from New York City, and I love Israel National News because they speak the truth.
The Jews were living in Israel long before the United States became a nation in 1776. Long before Columbus discovered America. Before the ancient Roman Empire. Israel, the homeland of the Jewish people forever and always. Even a kid knows that.
The Tamar Yonah Show.
Courage.
Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go.
Audacity.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
History. Miracles. Hope.
No more bloodshed. Shalom. Salam forever.
Israel.
Broadcasting from Bethel, just north of Jerusalem, D.C. That's right, Jerusalem, David's capital. King David's capital. King David's capital. And now, Tamar Yonah.
We're back with Dr. William Forstchen. Again, he's the author of the book 1 Second After. We're going to talk about that towards the end of the show, how you can get a copy if you would like to read about all of this information in a more storytelling way that is a no-putter-downer. So, Dr. Forstchen, let's pretend that the nation was hit, and what would happen in the next steps? How do you believe the White House would act? Your mayor, the municipality, he can't just go home to his family. He's going to feel some sense of responsibility. What would be their standard procedure, do you believe? And what about enemies? Let's say it was China that attacked the United States. I'm just, throwing this out. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but what if? Would they then send in soldiers and troops in order to take over, take the wealth, take the gold out of Fort Knox? I mean, whatever. What would happen in a larger scenario?
Let's go back. Let's start at the Cold War. The war-fighting strategy of the 1960s, 1970s, up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Wonderful acronym for that. MAD, M-A-D, Mutual Assured Destruction, which came down to no matter how many missiles you launch at us and totally annihilate the United States, we'll have enough left over somewhere that will do the same thing to you. So it's a game of insanity. Nobody wins. The scenarios typically were built around the idea that the very first detonations actually would be EMPs to try and blind their opponents' tracking systems and command and control systems. So to spin forward, you say, okay, let's take a Chinese scenario, though that would be highly unlikely in that China is just as vulnerable as we are. China has nothing to gain by doing something like this. Unlike some religious fanatic who thinks he has a lot to gain, the first response back would be an EMP. And then most likely ground detonations of nuclear weapons as well. How that would play out after that, I think we'd be in a global war within 24 to 48 hours. How it would end, well, I believe it was Einstein who said he didn't know how World War III would end, but he knew World War IV would start with sticks and clubs.
Right.
We would see a disintegration of the incredible progress that we've tried to gain over the last several centuries. So you're saying that if God forbid the United States would be attacked with an EMP, that they would still have the capability to launch atomic missiles or planes with atomic bombs or EMPs over other countries, even though the whole country's grid has gone down? Oh, absolutely, yes. Gosh, there's a great old movie. I just watched it the other night called Crimson Tide. And it's a scenario about what is called a boomer, a nuclear submarine, stars Denzel Washington, where they get a scrambled message that a war has started, and the debate is, do we launch or not? One boomer, meaning one of our nuclear attack submarines, can deliver upwards of 240 warheads anywhere in the world.
But how would they get that message?
Enough command and control systems in our military are EMP proofed that would still be communicated out. Mm-hmm. And that is the counterforce. The scenario that does have some people worried is that we're EMP'd and then we don't act, that we hold back for some reason or another, which in this citizen's view would only encourage an opponent to contemplate such a move. So it's massive retaliation, as it was back during the Cold War. What would happen in the White House and our major military command centers? Personnel would be evacuated to secured locations as they were on September 11th, 2001, and then they move from there. Mm-hmm. What happens after that? Well, again, as I've tried to emphasize, I deal in unclassified. That information is classified. And I want to add as well, the message I'm trying to get out with 1 second after is not a Tom Clancy type novel about a global war and such. I want us to look at what happens to me, what happens to you personally, right? You know, I'm talking to you right now from a third of the way around the world. What would happen to you tomorrow if this happens? What happens to me? What happens to my daughter? What happens to my friends? That's what I try to focus on in 1 second after. And it was a tough job doing it.
What about foreign troops? Would a country, let's move it back to Iran. Let's say that Iran attacked the United States. Would a country that was going to attack another country, would they then send in foreign troops? Would they launch an attack like that on the ground?
I would expect that there would be massive retaliation. Again, unclassified information, buzz on the internet is about the relocation of several carrier groups into the Persian Gulf and into the Indian Ocean as tensions increase in that region. Our overseas assets would remain intact. The damage, the great suffering, actually would not be to our military, but to our civilian population. All of us out here who are dependent on electricity for our daily lives, that shuts off, doesn't come back on. Our military bases overseas would continue to function and would react. But one of the things when I talk about this is that in our great confrontation with the Soviets across nearly half a century, I often comment, I said, I thank God the communists were allegedly atheists, because their dream of a global domination was to inherit a world that was still functioning, not to inherit a smoking ruin. But when you have an opponent who actually wants to trigger an apocalypse and thinks that that is the ultimate answer, and it doesn't matter if the world's a smoking ruin, that is an enemy I fear. If we do not react and convey strongly, don't even contemplate trying to do it, or if necessary, prevent them from doing it. And that's the big one, preventing them from doing it.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the United States and Europe, there are very large pockets of Muslim populations. In Paris, France, we see demonstrations that have taken place there, throwing cars over on its heads, breaking store windows, setting cars afire. We've seen it happen in Paris and London. Dearborn, Michigan is a very large population of Muslims. If indeed Iran were to attack the United States with an EMP bomb, do you believe that these populations inside of the West would in turn be an enemy to their host countries?
I did attend a conference again. Notice how many times I said unclassified today or declassified, because I want to make sure I don't get a phone call later saying, Bill, you shouldn't have said something.
All right.
In attending an unclassified conference with a remarkable woman who's quite an expert on this subject, and has been a consultant for the government, that's a big concern that she expresses, that the porous nature of our borders, undoubtedly there are cells here that if such an event happened, that would be their call to go out and raise further mayhem, take out whatever systems might have survived. So you've asked a very tough and a real serious question, and I think it is a real threat.
Mm-hmm. And just getting back to the criminal aspect, people who were not criminals before may turn into criminals. When you're hungry or you have a kid that's sick and you know that a doctor lives down the street and he might have some extra antibiotics and you need that, you might come with your shotgun. Or, they might show up at your door. Someone who you went to work with or school with or was a neighbor may not be so neighborly when it comes to life and death situations. So we can see a very violent population in a situation like this. You would agree?
Well, let me present, there used to be a wonderful TV series where the host always said, presented for your consideration, adult Twilight Zone series. There's two moral questions that I will say presented for your consideration. Question one, you're the warden at a medium security prison. It's 7 or 8 days into this event. None of your workers are coming in anymore, none of your guards, no food, no water. You have 600 criminals who range from dumb idiot kids on some drug charge up to rapists and murderers. You open the doors and let them go?
Good question.
What do you do?
What do they do?
What is the moral answer to that? The one that really haunted me after I asked the question, I was attending a conference with a lot of military types. They asked me to talk about some of the social implications. And I asked okay, you're commander of a base. You have a good working relationship with the civilian community that surrounds your base. All military bases here have a lot of civilian workers. We're hit by an EMP. It's 7 or 8 days into the event. You get calls from your MP at the gate saying, sir, we got a problem. We got about 2,000 people standing outside the gate. Would you please come down? You go down, and here are 2,000 of your fellow Americans, neighbors, and friends. They're not rioting. They're not trying to push the gate down to get in, to take whatever you still have in the PX. I might get a bit emotional talking about this. They're holding up their children, and they're begging you, please take my child, take my baby, and I will turn around and walk away. And then I asked these generals, what would you do? One of them came up to me afterwards, and he actually broke into tears. He said, God, Bill, I don't want to think about this, because when you said that, I could picture my grandchildren. I said, is your base capable, willing to maybe bring in 1,000 infants and small children? Now, let me add, where did I get the historical example of that? This is where I get emotional, because I talked to somebody who saw this. As people were being herded to trains to take them to Auschwitz, they turned to their former neighbors and held out their children and said, for God's sake, just take my baby, because I know what's going to happen to me. Take my baby and hide my baby, and I'll walk away. Jewish people had to face that, to literally hand their children off, saying, take my child and I'll walk away. Can you imagine our world like that today? That's something that people in America, except those who came here after the war, have never seen, but could happen after such an event.
Very, very emotional, very, very disturbing to think about a situation like that. How long would it take the United States to get back on the grid, to get itself back up on its feet and working again after it would go through an EMP attack?
Well, you're asking another tough question. I was at a conference several years ago organized by a group called Impact America. That's EMP, Act America. That's where I actually saw the videos I mentioned earlier about transmission lines blowing out. They had a team who presented a paper that evaluated the 500 of our largest generating systems in the eastern United States. Their estimate is that 5 years after an event, 400 out of those 500 generators would still be offline. We're talking about 80% of our power supply would still be offline 5 years later, to which in a room full of 1,000 people, there was silence. There was no objections. And then somebody with rather gallows humor actually said, well, maybe that's all we would need because the rest of us would be dead.
You write here on your website that trying to get back in the grid, you would have to order for parts that were perhaps made outside of the USA. It would take time to make the orders because try to get a message out, then have the thing shipped over, then brought over to the places where it needs to be reinstalled. And you write here, yes, help from old allies might be flooding in from countries around the world that would come to help America, but how to move it, how to distribute it, and at the same time provide medical aid and also rebuild the electrical grid step by step will still be overwhelming tasks. As said before, quote, the death of 1 million is a statistic. Our statistic could very well be that in a year's time, 9 out of 10 Americans will be dead. Dead from but one weapon, our global position shattered forever as we revert back into a third-rate power if we even still survive as a united system of states. You want to comment on that?
That is the nightmare. Nature abhors a vacuum. If 90% of our population dies, what happens to the land? The land is still rich. The land is there. The resources are there. We could even have a semi-benevolent, let's say China. We're here to help. We'll bring in hundreds of thousands of tons of food and everything else, we're also going to bring in a couple 100,000 of our military to help maintain order, and I think we're going to be here for a little while. Even those coming to help might have alternative intent by the time it's done. So the bottom line, though, is if America ever was hit by a major EMP assault, I doubt if we would recover in our lifetimes in terms of being a global power. And as a patriotic American, I would say a force that tries to maintain some form of global order and goodness. Consider what happened in Indonesia, where our carriers and ships raced to Indonesia after the tsunami, not to take over, but one carrier can provide a hospital to sustain 10,000 people, enough electricity to power 100,000. All of the acts of goodness that America and Israel have done out of a sense of humanitarianism across the years, that force would be gone.
Tell us about your book 1 second after, how you got the idea to write it, how it's been received by the populace, and where people can get it.
Wow. I started working on the book back actually within days after the 2004 commission report came out and was totally ignored. I have a close friendship with former presidential candidate Newt Gingrich. It was actually Newt who urged me to write the book. From there, I met with the members of Congress who had been on the committee, who pointed out there was no constituency. And also, this does sound kind of sci-fi, doesn't it? So people weren't taking it seriously. The big inspiration for the book was my own family. My father in a nursing home, wondering what would happen to him, and my young daughter, what kind of world she would grow up in. When the book first came out, I think the publisher printed 10,000 copies, figured that's about how many would go. It's up around something around 400,000 copies out now in the States and printed in 15 countries overseas, and has been kicked around a bit as a film. Fortunately, I have a wonderful agent who insists that if they make the film, it is to be done accurately and not turned into some sci-fi pulp like this TV series that just came out a couple of weeks ago that mentions EMP. My goal was to wind up talking with you today, or anyone who's willing to listen and get the word out. This is serious, and we got to be prepared.
And people can get your book where?
I would say from Israel, you're going to have to go online. I don't believe we have. I'm not sure if I have in this really contract yet or not. Just go online to one of the book distributors online, and you can get an electronic version. And as long as your Kindle or Nook or iPad keeps working, you can read it there, or you can get a hard copy.
Okay, and you can get that at Amazon.com.
Yes.
All right, and you're a history professor, and yet you were able to write this because how did you learn about the scientific aspects of this subject?
When I was in graduate school, my major was in military history at Purdue with an incredible professor, Gunther Rothenberg, who was actually German Jewish, was a British commando, and then fought in the Israeli War of Independence in the Battle of Jerusalem. So that explains in part my respect and love for Israel and his stories about surviving those times. I minored in the history of military technology, and that is when I first became aware of the issue of EMP and would be sitting back talking with my mentor about, oh my God. And even then, back when I was a student of his in the early 90s, he was expressing concern that the two most vulnerable targets for an EMP, Israel or the United States. And that's the picture we're looking at today.
And so it might even be better to say that it would be safer for the world to set off a regular standard atomic bomb over a city than an EMP that would kill 90% of the American population. I mean, can we go as far as saying something so audacious as that?
Horrific, but yes. God forbid, but consider Iran putting a fusion Hiroshima-sized bomb onto Tel Aviv and the horror that would create versus taking that same weapon and lofting it over Israel to totally take out its power grid. and its command and control structure would do far more damage within a day or two than dropping a bomb into the middle of a city. We have to think beyond the images of the nightmare of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to a completely different way of fighting war, which is what EMP is, and which is why I believe Iran is striving to achieve a nuclear weapon.
Wow. So basically you're saying that the world should really listen to what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said about red lines, that best to stop this before it could ever take place.
Amen. Yes. I was freaked, shall I say. I was awed when he did that, because he had the guts to say to the rest of the world, wake up before it is too late. The world needs more leaders like him.
Dr. William Forstchen, one of the ways to wake up is to read your book and to understand in a storytelling way what would really happen if something like this happened, and to realize the immensity of it, get to know the characters so you really are emotionally involved in this and can really understand the devastating effects of what this would mean for the entire world. And I want to thank you very much for coming on the show today and speaking with us about this.
Thank you, and please know that tens of millions of Americans stand firmly with Israel this day.
Thank you very much. And to our listeners, if you have any comments or questions about this show, feel free to email me at Tamar, Tamar, at IsraelNationalRadio.com.